Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Centre for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
Why would the U.S. and its allies launch attacks against Syria over the use of chemical weapons before international inspectors can investigate the claims? Can the sources of claims of chemical weapons attacks in Syria be trusted? Is there a pattern to the timing of the alleged chemical weapons attacks? Is it possible that financial investors within the U.S., France, and Britain may have had inside knowledge as to the successful outcome of the U.S.-led airstrikes? Might British Prime Minister Theresa May have been among those who personally profited from the attacks? On this week's Global Research News Hour, we take a closer look at the US, UK, and French military assault on targets within Syria and the outcome of that operation. We'll first get an update from 21st Century Wire editor and journalist Vanessa Beeley, who has been on the ground in Damascus for the past 5 weeks. We'll also get an analysis from Professor Michel Chossudovsky about revelations of a conflict of interest on the part of Prime Minister May, whose husband works for a huge financial firm heavily invested in military companies profiting from the recent airstrikes. On this week's program, who benefits from the Syrian airstrikes? Conversations with Vanessa Beeley and Michel Chossudovsky. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of April 20th, 2018. I am series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg on occupied Anishinaabe territory on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. The U.S. government responds to each exposure of its lies by concocting new ones. The chemical weapons charge followed directly after the collapse of the unsubstantiated British and U.S. claims that Russia carried out the attempted assassination on British soil of its former agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia using a nerve agent. Both Yulia and Sergei are now on their way to a full recovery despite having supposedly been poisoned with the most fatal military-grade agent in existence. Yesterday's report by the FBI and the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, advisory Russian state-sponsored cyber actors targeting network infrastructure devices, is no more credible. Like previous charges leveled by the intelligence agencies against Moscow, there is not a single piece of evidence contained in the document to back them up. That comes from the article, As Lies on Syrian Gas Attack Unravel, U.S. and U.K. Shift to Claims of Russian Cyber War, by Will Morrow, posted April 19th, originally appearing at World Socialist website. Hundreds of Palestinians were gunned down on Land Day and during demonstrations for the right to return. Netanyahu has the full support of the U.S., so there is no outrage and he will not pay for his crimes. Netanyahu has every reason to believe that the U.S. will protect him, as the U.S. has many times in the past. Nikki Haley is not going to hold up pictures of dead Palestinian children. Instead, she will shield Netanyahu from criticism and accuse his critics of being anti-Semitic. That comes from the article, The Victims in Syria, Gaza, and Yemen, U.S. Outrage versus U.S. Crimes Against Humanity, by David William Pear, posted April 19th, originally appearing at the Greenville Post. Diaz-Canel is seen as a competent official, loyal to the system Fidel established. He appeared often on Cuban television, playing an increasingly important role in political affairs. Older generation freedom fighters greatly aged or passed. Diaz-Canel's ascension to power likely represents a combination of revolutionary continuity with changes he'll pursue. It'll be a while to see the course he intends to follow. That comes from the article, Cuba Chooses a New President, by Stephen Ledman, posted April 19th. Russian embassy officials have not been able to meet Yulia Skripal, and the UK's Home Office rejected Victoria Skripal's visa application, quote, because it did not comply with the immigration rules, unquote. Theresa May and her government cannot survive an uncovering of their Novichok fraud. A UK election in response to the truth will not only bring down the government, it should give Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party a healthy majority. Given Corbyn's anti-establishment positions on many issues, including the Mideast, and his skepticism about this fraud, the British deep state will find that possibility unacceptable. A couple of Russian lives do not matter in this scenario. That comes from the article, The Skripals Have Survived, But They Are Not Safe. The Novichok Fraud Should Bring Down the UK Government, by Karen Brothers, posted April 19th. Mounting evidence shows that both the Skripal and Syrian incidents were actually false flag provocations, likely carried out by or with the connivance of Western intelligence services. The target of both provocations was, without question, the Russian state and its president, Vladimir Putin. Of course, Syria has also long been on the hit list of Middle Eastern nations targeted for regime change by the U.S. neocons after 9/11, with Israel a key beneficiary. Numerous news sources are documenting the false flag nature of these incidents that will not be repeated here. Note, however, that it has been the British that have been whining the loudest in both cases, though if Theresa May and her cronies, along with Francis Macron, do succeed in starting a war with Russia, it will be the U.S. military that does the heavy lifting. The same as the U.S. did in World Wars I and II in Britain's epic geopolitical campaign to take down its greatest continental rival, Germany. That comes from the article, The British Are Driving the West's War Agenda, But Why? By Richard C. Cook, posted April 19th. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. The US, UK, and France launched airstrikes against 3 supposed chemical weapons facilities in Syria on April 14th. Interestingly, just before international inspectors from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, could have investigated the supposed chemical weapons attack 7 days previous that was used as a pretext for the Western military action. To get an overview of the situation 5 days after the airstrikes, we reached Vanessa Beeley. She is an associate editor of 21st Century Wire and has been reporting on the ground in Syria for the past month.
We have this extraordinary situation where actually France, the UK and the United States, with the help of Israel, conducted an unlawful criminal act of aggression against the sovereign nation of Syria, on the basis of what is effectively social media chatter from open sources, which effectively mean organizations like the White Helmets, who we know to be financed by the very same states who conducted this hostile act against Syria and its people. And that alongside a number of other embedded NGOs and organizations who have very clear funding links to those who have a vested interest in the regime change war inside Syria. So, that's the first point to be made here. And those strikes were conducted just as the OPCW was literally on its way to Damascus, having been actually invited by the Syrian government and having had their visas expedited by the Syrian government. So the narrative that the Syrian government or even its Russian allies have been trying to prevent the OPCW's entry into the alleged chemical weapons site at Douma is ridiculous in the extreme. The OPCW, I believe, tried to go in yesterday. We heard that there were shots fired at the OPCW as they arrived in Duma. So having had a delay while they requested permission from the UN Security Council, there was a delay from the UN Security Council itself. And in fact, the OPCW, we've been told here, don't need that permission because they have a predated agreement with Syria that they can come to Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government, and they can inspect any site to determine whether chemical weapons have been used. And so when the OPCW finally went into Duma today, shots were fired and they withdrew. I haven't seen any reports since then. I've been told that the shots were fired by terrorist groups in an area that is still under their occupation, which is close to the area of Yarmouk camp to the south of Damascus. And so therefore there is a strong suspicion here that not only are the members of the UN Security Council, so the United States, France and Britain, keen to prevent the OPCW investigation, but we're also seeing their assets on the ground reacting against the OPCW investigation. And of course this comes on the back of the Russian military investigation, statements which were released through the Russian Ministry of Defense that Syrian Arab Red Crescent and UN agencies on the ground had said that there was no chemical weapon attack on the night in question, that in fact patients were being brought into the hospital suffering from respiratory problems, from smoke and dust, from a military campaign attack. We don't actually know whether it was as a result of from the Syrian Arab Army or from the terrorist groups. But certainly they were not complaining of any form of chemical weapon attack symptoms. And there are, of course, the two protagonists in the videos that were being put out claiming it was a chemical weapon attack, who have given an interview saying exactly that this was not a chemical weapon attack. They were not treating the patients who were coming in for any form of chemical weapon attack. And then I believe in the last couple of days, a Russian journalist has actually located one of the children that was filmed in the alleged chemical weapon attack video being doused with water. And again, he has corroborated the story that this was not a chemical weapon attack. And a number of other, even mainstream journalists like Robert Fisk of The Independent, who's probably one of the most sort of acclaimed Middle East correspondents, he has basically reiterated the Russian position that this was not a chemical weapon attack, or that at least this narrative was questionable in the extreme. And a number of other mainstream media from various EU member states have come and pretty much come to the same conclusion. So it's very hard to sort of follow through the narrative that is now being proposed by corporate media in the West, that the victims of this chemical weapon attack somehow made it onto the buses with all the terrorist groups to be evacuated to Idlib, and are now showing symptoms or remnants of the chemical weapon attack in Idlib. So to me, this appears to be sort of one of the most extraordinary, elaborate false flags that I think we've witnessed in Syria, and we've seen quite a few. Added to which, in the last few weeks, I've actually been into districts of Eastern Ghouta, and today to the IDP center in Al-Hawajah, close to Eastern Ghouta.
How close?
And very close. I mean, this is an area where probably less than a kilometer. This is where people came to after they had evacuated from the various liberated areas of Eastern Ghouta during the military campaign. The Syrian government and the Russian reconciliation organizations on the ground opened the humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to be evacuated, and those who could not be reunited with family in Damascus city center went into the incredibly well organized, I have to say, internally displaced persons camps that were set up specifically to take these families in. And the one that I visited today is housing around 20,000 people. And just, I mean, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, this is only, probably a couple of weeks after the full liberation. Children are back at school. The kitchens are running like a sort of, like clockwork, to produce food for the 20,000 people. I watched cleaning materials, washing materials being handed out to civilians living in the camp. And I entered a lot of the rooms in the camp. I mean, you know, I have to say, what they've provided is quite extraordinary. I mean, these are like small houses. Most of them only have one family living in them, from what I can see. They're well taken care of. The children in the schools are ecstatic. Is the best way I can describe it. I mean, it was actually very uplifting to go into the schoolrooms to talk to these children who didn't have really a proper education for the 5 or 6 years of the terrorist occupation, are now studying French, history, maths, sciences, in really well-equipped schoolrooms with very dedicated teachers. Some of them were among those civilians who left Eastern Ghouta, and they've continued teaching those children. So this was actually sort of a very heartwarming experience to go into these camps and to speak to these people who are now actually being given food, being given medical treatment, and being given social security help from the Syrian government and, you know, from the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and from a number of civil society organizations. But what was interesting is talking to a number of people today from various districts of Eastern Ghouta, and I will be covering all of their testimony in a number of articles, but basically what they told me was that the White Helmets and a number of other organizations that they said were financed by foreign actors, predominantly actually by the British. The British was definitely number one at the top of the sort of intelligence operations inside Eastern Ghouta. And they described the fact that they would be told, or they would be warned in their neighborhood about 2 days prior to an alleged chemical weapon attack. So they would be told to clear their buildings, to leave their houses on a particular day. And the one comment that was made by pretty much everybody that I spoke to was that they began to learn that those alleged chemical weapon attacks would always occur around a UN Security Council meeting or one of the peace talks, for example, in Astana, something that was pivotal or crucial to the Syrian conflict. They learned to expect an alleged chemical weapon attack because, you know, we've been told about the ones in August 2013, the Douma one recently, and the Khan Sheikhoun attack in 1 year ago, basically, in April 2017. But there's been a number, as we know, of relatively unreported or you know, other chemical attacks that have not received the same outrage. But I think if we map those chemical attacks out, you will see that they will coincide with the advancement of the Syrian Arab Army in a number of military campaigns, whether it is in East Aleppo or whether it's in Eastern Ghouta. And equally, if you map them out, they will probably coincide with, as the civilians have said, with UN Security Council resolutions or meetings, etc. And so this is coming from the civilians themselves, and they told me that they were warned in advance of a chemical weapon attack. They were told to evacuate the buildings concerned. They also told me that predominantly it is only children that are affected by these chemical weapon attacks. I mean, I met one civilian in Zamalka, one of the areas that was affected by the alleged chemical weapon attack in August 2013. He lost 5 children in that attack. But the story he told me was basically that they were somehow knocked out in their apartment, even though he explained to me that there was no evidence of an actual attack, but he and his children were knocked unconscious somehow. He to this day doesn't know how. He was on a first floor apartment with the windows had actually been broken, so there was air circulating. When he awoke from that loss of consciousness about 8 hours later, he and his wife were on their own in the Kafra Batna hospital, which was close to the Zamalka district where he was. Their 5 children had gone missing. It took him almost 36 hours to ascertain that 3 of his children were declared dead by the terrorists and by the White Helmets in Eastern Ghouta. When he went to the Erbil Center to find out what had happened to his children, they would not show him the bodies. They only showed him the photograph of 3 of the children, and to this day, the other 2 children are missing. Now, what he told me was that if this were a chemical weapon attack, he and 2 other civilians were the only ones affected in his building and in the surrounding area. So, if this were a chemical weapon attack, why were not all the civilians in that building affected, right? So, I think what has happened with the liberation of Eastern Ghouta, and this is perhaps why we're seeing such a robust reaction from the NATO member states who are waging this dirty war in Syria, it is because I believe, having spent some time in Eastern Ghouta, that Eastern Ghouta is going to expose the intelligence psyop that has been running in Syria for the last 7 years. I think Eastern Ghouta was largely the center of this psyop, and of course Eastern Ghouta had particular relevance to Israel, and to Saudi Arabia, but particularly to Israel, because of course it had, the terrorist factions had taken over Damascus air defense systems in Eastern Ghouta, but it also meant that effectively they could hold the Syrian government to ransom with the daily shelling and mortar fire into civilian areas of Damascus city center. So it was a collective punishment of the Syrian civilians in Damascus, the 6 million or so, even more civilians there. So the end or the liberation of Eastern Ghouta is a huge victory for Syria against international terrorism, and it's a very big defeat with huge ramifications, I believe, for the U.S. coalition.
So you're suggesting, I mean, you said something I've never heard before, that East Ghouta, because I was thinking of the comparisons between Ghouta and Aleppo, and especially as you were talking about this convergence of the same kind of pattern of there's some important event that's going to happen in UN Security Council. In the case of Aleppo, and you're seeing that the Syrian Arab army is winning, and that's when you start to see a rash of Amnesty International and other human rights reports and other news suggesting, oh my God, it's a terrible tragedy. We got to think of the children, and it seems to be a repeated pattern. But in this case, you're saying that East Ghouta seemed to be the center of this campaign, where we're getting all this imagery showing all of the devastation, and then that, if that is the case, it's only a matter of time before that gets out there.
Yeah. Well, and I think what perhaps what the Syrian government and actually their Russian allies have learned from East Aleppo is to capitalize upon the evidence that is going to be exposed once these areas are liberated. And so what I have actually seen is a concerted Syrian investigation on the ground in Eastern Ghouta, and I have to say they're doing a very, very efficient job. I mean, right now, I would say that the U.S. administration, the UK Foreign Office, and its MI6 operatives, France and the GGSE and a number of EU member state intelligence agencies should be very worried right now, because from what I have seen in my relatively limited experience of going into Eastern Ghouta 3 or 4 times, I'm seeing the investigations that are being conducted are very in-depth, they're very organized, and they're very, very detailed. And they're going to be bringing very important information to the surface. And I think it's actually going to be pretty shocking. I mean, for example, even today in the IDP center, I met one guy who was a driver, an ambulance driver at one of the hospitals that was frequented by the White Helmets. Now, you know, he gave me a fair amount of information about the White Helmets that even I had not been able to confirm. I had suspicions, but I'd not been able to confirm them. That a number of the White Helmet operatives were foreigners. Not all of them were Syrian, by all means, but exactly the same as many of the terrorist groups in eastern Ghouta had a huge number of foreigners among them. We were told from Zamalka alone, or rather from, I think, around 4 or 5 districts of eastern Ghouta, 280 British passports holders left in the buses to Idlib with the various terrorist groups. So as I said, you know, the information that is actually coming out of eastern Ghouta is really quite revelatory. And what this ambulance driver told me, he said there were a number of foreigners among the White Helmets. He said the White Helmets were receiving around $500 a month, while the actual trained paramedics like himself, he was a paramedic and an ambulance driver, was only receiving around $100. And he said actually that wasn't consistent. He told me, as so many other people have told me, particularly in East Aleppo, that the White Helmets did nothing to help civilians. They were there predominantly to help the militants. One child, one 13-year-old boy that we met in the IDP camp today, who had lost a leg, he was on crutches. He told us that he came from an area called Hamulia. He'd been injured in a terror shelling of his neighborhood. He was picked up and taken to the White Helmet Center, and while he was unconscious, they simply removed his leg. They didn't even try to operate on him. And this, again, is a story that is consistent with what we were told by so many, particularly children, but adults also in East Aleppo, that if they were injured in any way, even lightly, they would often lose their limb because they didn't want to have to treat them. So, you know, again, the number of testimonies that are coming to the surface here are going to basically unravel the propaganda constructs that have been created by particularly the United States and the UK and infiltrated and embedded into Syria to provide the narrative that facilitates, as we've seen, to terrifying effect recently, to facilitate an escalation of military conflict, or, you know, the pseudo-humanitarian context for intervention, also the calls for a no-fly zone, etc. And actually tonight, the military campaign to liberate the area to the south of Damascus, Yarmouk, which is known as the Palestinian camp. It's not a camp, it's a suburb of Damascus. That military campaign intensified tonight. So actually what we're seeing are ISIS factions firing rockets now into Damascus city center, a different area, into an area of Maidan, for example. And a number of buildings have actually been very badly damaged and destroyed this evening. And we're hearing again the jets overhead and the boom of artillery, because now they will basically push forward to get rid of ISIS and the remnants of other terrorist factions. I believe Nusra Front left Yarmouk in about 1 year ago, so now it's predominantly ISIS and a number of branch-offs from ISIS and Al-Qaeda that are occupying Yarmouk camp.
You know, Vanessa, I think on behalf of my listeners, I mean, we really appreciate the work you're doing and the fresh on-the-ground reporting that you're doing, even if there are some so-called independent news outlets that don't. So thank you so much for everything you've done. I know you're very tired, but I hope we can get some more updates in the not-too-distant future.
Sure, I would love to.
Okay, so we're speaking, that was Vanessa Beeley, Associate Editor with 21st Century Wire, and she's speaking to us from Damascus. You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcast out of Winnipeg on campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. We are also podcast on the website globalresearch.ca. Regardless of whether or not there actually was a chemical weapons attack in Douma on April 7th, and whether or not Syrian President Assad was responsible for such an incident, the actions taken by the alliance of the US, UK, and France were on extremely questionable legal ground. The United Nations Charter explicitly accords the United Nations Security Council with the responsibility of assessing threats to peace and the existence of aggression, and the responsibility to authorize the use of force in order to restore international peace and security, except in the instance of individual or collective self-defense of a member nation against aggression. Clearly, the April 14th airstrikes do not meet that standard. Consequently, the Russian Federation tabled a resolution on the same day calling on the UN Security Council to condemn the strikes by the US and its allies as aggression in violation of international law. The motion was defeated, not surprisingly, by the US, UK, and France, along with Côte d'Ivoire, Kuwait, the Netherlands, Poland, and Sweden. 4 Security Council nations abstained, leaving only Russia, China, and Bolivia voting in favor. Syria's representative to the UN, Bashar Jafari, was particularly outspoken and scorned the 3 aggressor nations for not sharing their information about Syria's production of chemical weapons with the OPCW. There are conflicting accounts about the success of the strikes. The Pentagon claimed on April 14th that all 105 missiles hit their target, with 76 hitting a research and development center in Barzah, Damascus, 22 hitting a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs, and 7 hitting a chemical weapons bunker nearby. The Russian Defense Ministry, on the other hand, claimed that the Syrian government was able to shoot down 71 of the 103 missiles launched by the US-led bloc. Specifically, they shot down 4 out of 4 missiles aimed at the area of the Damascus International Airport, 12 out of 12 launched at Al-Dumair Military Airport, 18 out of 18 launched at Bali Military Airport, 12 out of 12 launched at Sherat Military Airport, 5 out of 9 launched at Mezeh Military Airport, 13 out of 16 launched at Homs Military Airport, and 7 out of 30 launched at targets in the areas of Barzah and Jarmani. It is worth noting that the Russian envoy to the OPCW claims that Russia has, quote, unquote, irrefutable proof that the Douma chemical attack was a false flag orchestrated by British intelligence services with help from the U.S. designed to provide a pretext for the missile strike. In spite of President Trump's declaration of mission accomplished, even U.S. officials questioned the success of the mission, given their statements to Reuters that their storage of chemical weapons agents were scattered far beyond the sites in question. With the Syrian government continuing to make gains against the rebel-held areas and the chemical weapons provocation questioned as a motive, one wonders what the actual point of this mission might have been. Prime Minister May approved of the decision to participate in airstrikes against what the US, UK, France alliance deemed to be chemical weapons facilities in Syria, without a formal vote in the House of Commons and without UN sanction. It turns out that the Prime Minister's husband, Philip May, happens to work for the investment firm Capital Group, which happens to be the single largest shareholder in the arms manufacturer BAE Systems, which built the so-called Storm Shadow missiles, 8 of which were reportedly fired by UK forces at targets in Syria alleged by the Western Alliance to be chemical weapons facilities. According to figures available as of March 31st, 2018, 1 week before the chemical weapons attack was supposed to have occurred, Capital Group's holdings in BAE stood at 360,000 shares, an increase of 11% over the previous quarter. Philip May's firm also is the second largest shareholder in the U.S. military arms firm Lockheed Martin. Both BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin saw their stock prices soar in the wake of the Syria airstrikes. Given that Philip May is reportedly an informal advisor to the Prime Minister, does his involvement in Capital Group constitute a conflict of interest in this or other instances of aggression, even when the use of such force may be legitimate? Are the other NATO powers similarly compromised in their use of force? To discuss these questions, we're joined once again by Professor Michel Chossudovsky. Michel Chossudovsky is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Ottawa, the founder and director of the Center for Research on Globalization, editor of globalresearch.ca, and author of more than 1,000 articles, scholarly publications, and chapters in books. He's also the author of 11 books, including The Globalization of Poverty in the New World Order, first published in 1997 and updated in 2003, and The Globalization of War, America's Long War Against Humanity. Professor Chossudovsky, it's great to have you back on the program.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be on the program. As we say, war is good for business, but speculating on particular outcomes when you know what will be the outcome is a multi-million-dollar endeavor. The issue is, if you really want to make money on the stocks of Lockheed Martin and British Aerospace, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, in other words, the large defense contractors, you have to not only have inside information on the conduct and the timing of that military operation, but you also have to know what is the likely outcome. And the likely outcome was actually known to a limited number of people in the United States, France, and Britain. And they knew the outcome because they knew that the Russians would not activate their air defense system, the S-400. Why did they know that? Because prior to the conduct of this operation, they had actually negotiated with the Russians. They had said, we will not attack any of your facilities. These are predetermined targets, and the Russians agreed on the predetermined targets. In other words, the whole thing was staged. It was not really a military attack, a bona fide military attack where the defensive capabilities of the S-400 were deployed. And consequently, because of that, they knew that none of their high-tech jet fighters would actually be knocked out of the sky by the S-400. They knew that in advance. Now, if you don't know that in advance, you can bet and say, well, you know, if they knock them out of the sky, then the stocks of Lockheed Martin will literally plunge, okay? That didn't happen. But the normal speculator who didn't have that advanced information would place his bets and say, well, I think the Russians are going to actually respond, which they didn't. And I think everybody, you know, people who read newspapers and reports and so on said, well, this is very dangerous. The United States is going to come in. They're going to bomb Syria. Then the Russians are going to knock them out of the sky with the S-400. Then it's escalation. And then Lockheed Martin stocks might plunge because they lose face because their bloody aircrafts have been knocked down by the Russian air defense system. Didn't happen.
Could you speak to that? Could you speak to that issue of foreknowledge? Because, I mean, I'm looking at the stock indications. We see the stock going up after April 16th. What evidence do we have that there were certain people who had that foreknowledge? Where does that foreknowledge manifest itself?
Well, that foreknowledge manifests itself in the office of Theresa May and her husband, Philip May, and in the office of President Macron, and of course the main protagonists, of course, are it's the Defense Secretary, the White House, etc., the National Security Advisor. There are quite a number of people who know what's going to happen. Okay, there are quite a number of people. Some of them are advisors. Of course, all this top secret, but admittedly, if Theresa May talks to her husband, who runs one of the largest, financial investment outfits with stocks and so on and so forth, well, her husband, what's he going to do? He's going to, because that's the whole basis of speculative trade. You bet on an outcome. And I haven't investigated the matter, but essentially you bet on the fact that the overall index of defense contractors on the stock market is going to go up. Okay, in other words, those stocks are going to go up, so you bet on an upward movement. And if you're using option trade, then we're talking about put and ask. The put option is when you're betting on the fact that the whole thing is going to collapse. Okay, so some people bet on the collapse of the Dow Jones. It's a put option. And if it's an ask option, well, they're betting on the fact that it's going up. Now, how do you make money on those kinds of operations? It's only if you know what the outcome is going to be. If you're and there's an issue of timing and so on. But in this particular case, the outcome of that attack was known in advance, that the Russians would not respond. Nobody else knew that. Well, there were a fair number of people involved in decision-making, but nobody else. Now, that information was, of course, crucial to the speculators, to the investment, to the financial institutions which may have received that information. And I would suspect, of course, the outfit of the husband of the Prime Minister of Great Britain had that information. I would suspect that Lockheed Martin also had that because President Macron was a former employee of Lockheed Martin. And of course, the Trump family and their links to Wall Street, the people there, obviously had that kind of information to a lesser or greater extent. Certainly Trump had it, and his cronies would certainly have betted on the results. He said, "Oh, it's safe. Go ahead, bet on an upward movement of the stocks of Lockheed Martin and Boeing and so on, because we're going to come out successfully in that operation, and then none of our military capabilities are going to be attacked by the Russian S-400s." Well, they don't even need to explain that. They just say, go ahead and bet.
Okay, I just want to stop you right there because I think some of our listeners are familiar with the speculative trading that was going on days in advance of the 9/11 attacks, which on United and American Airlines stock, people who would suggest foreknowledge that these attacks were going to happen, based on the unusual number of put and call options. Do we have any indications yet of unusual trading activity in advance of this military exercise, or is that something we're still investigating?
Well, that's something that has to be looked in very carefully. There's data on option trading. I think what we can reasonably say at this stage is that this is not strictly a conflict of interest regarding Theresa May and her husband. It's far more serious. In this particular case, the company of which he is a senior executive it's a massive investment firm, both in Britain and the United States, and it owns something of the order of 10% of Lockheed Martin. Some say it's 7%, but other estimates say up to 10%. And it also owns when I say it owns that on behalf of customers as well. But nonetheless, it's a bonanza for the May family. And it means that the British Prime Minister has fed information to her husband which enables personal enrichment by that specific family. And the same thing goes for the Trump family. Now, I don't think that this this particular incident is. I don't think that this process of corruption and fraud is limited to a single military event. They've been doing it all along. In other words, since Theresa May became prime minister, her husband is receiving foreknowledge of various various statements that she's going to make, which will have impact on money markets, including Brexit, of course. So every time Theresa May opens her mouth and says, "Oh, Brexit, this, that, and the other," well, her husband already has foreknowledge of that and can speculate on what happens at the level of the stock markets. It's a form of enrichment, which is first of all leads to tremendous wealth because you can use options, and it is directly the result of the complicity of heads of state and heads of government with powerful financial institutions. In this particular case, we have a financial family in Downing Street with Theresa and Philip May, and of course we have a tycoon, a real estate tycoon with links to Wall Street, who's in the White House and who does exactly the same, and whose cronies make billions of dollars simply on the basis of receiving foreknowledge of public statements which the president or his cronies will make. So that is the nature of this. Now, let's put the Theresa May issue into perspective. Theresa May is a liar regarding. Well, she's a serial liar because she's lied on the Skripal affair, the so-called nerve agent saga. She's lied with regard to the chemical weapons attack in Duma, making statements which were undocumented, with a view to actually launching that attack on Friday evening after the closure of the stock markets. And she's third, she is a fraud. Well, she's a war criminal as well because people get killed as a result of her actions. So there you have a liar, a war criminal, and a financial fraud combined. And I think that I don't think, well, I was born in Wales and I'm British, and I don't recall any previous head of government, prime minister, who had that kind of triangular denomination of being a war criminal, a liar, and a fraud. Well, she is all three. And I would say that under normal conditions, that government should topple, should fall.
Do you see this government being brought down? Because I don't see much messaging about this coming from the opposition benches. I
don't see it happening. I don't see it happening because despite the fact that Robert Fisk's article was published in The Independent and there were several testimonies of what happened in Duma, all of that now has been sort of squashed away, and the mainstream media is coming out with lies and fabrications. And as I would say, and that's very important, when the lie becomes the truth, there's no moving backwards. That is the nature of the crisis that we're living through at this moment.
I want to try.
It's a systematic lies, and these are actually transformed into truth by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on. And people are misinformed as to what is going on. The independent media is, of course, threatened as well. But I think that is a fundamental issue. Now, look what's happening to the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement in Britain is not necessarily bringing out the lies and the financial killings issue. They are, in fact, taking on a position which is pretty ambiguous. And then you have people like Tariq Ali, who actually is calling for regime change in Syria.
Yeah. Could I?
And Tariq Ali happens to be one of the protagonists of the anti-war movement in Great Britain.
Could I get, just keeping the focus on the financial incentives behind war, I'm just wanting to try to help our listeners understand the dimensions of this, because how this incident involving the maze is different from a lot of the messaging we've seen over the years about the military-industrial complex and how defense contractors make money from war. You know, Dick Cheney's Halliburton and Kellogg, Brown and Root, the Bushes and the Carlyle Group. That you do have this kind of convergence between the economic these major multinationals and who create this incentive for going to war, and the politicians that they lobby for, finance, what have you. That creates this overall incentive for the utilizing military force and militarism. And I'm wondering if the incidents that you're referring to with regard to May and Capital Group, if you could help clarify that difference.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, what we are generally focusing on is how politicians are being lobbied. How the military-industrial complex in the United States acts as a lobby group and co-opts politicians, okay, one after the other. And they are essentially doing that to ensure that Lockheed Martin, Boeing, et al. Will receive multi-billion-dollar contracts from the Department of Defense, from the Pentagon. And of course, the 1.3 or 1.2 trillion dollar nuclear weapons program. That's all lobbying, and that's war. War is good for business as far as the so-called defense contractors are concerned. That's happening, and that is of a specific nature and different to what we've just discussed, because here we are dealing with the selling of foreknowledge from politicians to financiers. So that, in other words, you have inside information that something is going to happen, and you slip that on to your broker on Wall Street, and then they speculate on the outcomes. And that is something which is quite routine. Mm-hmm. I mean, for instance, take Bloomberg. Well, Bloomberg is a news agency, but it's also an investor on Wall Street. So they come up with news reports. Inevitably, and I don't wish to criticize them, inevitably they have foreknowledge of what they're going to publish as far as reporting on particular economic events. And the same thing is true for the New York Times. But then, at the same time, they're investing in Wall Street based on foreknowledge of news items for which many people have foreknowledge. I think of the various monthly indicators of employment and so on that we know about. But here we're dealing with something. We're dealing with a level of corruption which is beyond the lobby type of relationship that politicians have to defense contractors. Here we're dealing with the relationship between the head of government, Theresa May, and one of the most powerful financial groups on planet Earth, which can speculate based on foreknowledge of what Mrs. May is going to say and what Mrs. May is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the outcome there's the outcome of those statements as well. I mean, it's not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not simply the foreknowledge of foreknowledge regarding an attack on Syria, but it is also the foreknowledge of the outcome of that attack. Will it lead to escalation? Will it lead to Russian blowing off aircraft in the skies of the Eastern Mediterranean, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I think just an important distinction to make is that you do lay out a very important case about the possibility of capitalizing on this sort of information, but we don't really have, as yet, at least as far as I'm aware, any documentation of unusual trading activities stemming from such speculative or insider knowledge. And so I guess what you're suggesting is that's something we really need to watch out for in the days ahead, so that we can basically cement the case that this sort of thing is going on. And that, one would hope, would lead to some sort of repeal of this prime minister and the larger agenda.
Well, I think that, of course, the research has to be undertaken. Of course, I recall, because that was a theme of your program a couple of weeks ago regarding the legacy of Michael Rupert. Well, Michael Rupert actually took the trouble of looking at these transactions, options trades on those companies of the airlines, okay, United Airlines, and came to the conclusion that there was some very unusual financial transactions which preceded the 9/11, and as a result of 9/11, of course, they reaped billions and billions of dollars of revenue, and that, of course, that indicated that some people knew that 9/11 was going to happen, and they speculated on the results, and the result of those investigations are impeccable. Now, I would suspect that what we need now is that the trading in defense stocks should be the object of some investigation, both in terms of options, but also in terms of actual transactions, movements. I noticed, of course, that on the Friday, Lockheed Martin's value of the stock had declined, not by very much, but was on the downward movement. It was about 0.25%, I think, but it was in the red. And then, of course, you have the weekend, and then it shoots up on Monday morning. And typically, those kinds of speculative ops are best. I mean, I'm talking about actually the airstrike. The airstrike was timed with Wall Street. It took place after the closure of financial markets worldwide. And then, of course, when financial markets open up on Monday morning, then you have a movement in stock values.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there, but thanks so much once again for your thoughts, Professor Chossudovsky.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be on the program.
We've been speaking with Michel Chossudovsky. He is the founder and director of the Center for Research on Globalization and editor of globalresearch.ca. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can listen to our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. I'm series host, creator, and producer Michael Welch. Join us again next week.